Hello and welcome to a special installment of Mahoning Valley Historical Society's Bites and Bits of History, strolling through Oak Hill Cemetery. This year, in lieu of our walking tour, we are providing you with this video presentation. Myself, Frank Rulli, a volunteer with the Historical Society, and our Curator of Education, Traci Manning, will be your tour guides. In 1850, leading citizens from Youngstown gathered to form the Mahoning Cemetery Association. Their goal was to create the first and arguably the finest rural cemetery in the valley. By 1853, they had purchased 16 acres from Dr. Henry Manning, the president of the association, and by 1854, interment had begun. By the 1870s, you could argue that the cemetery was fully realized. Prior to Oak Hill Cemetery, the dead were interred in Youngstown's Township Cemetery, located immediately off of Central Square. By the 1840s, this cemetery had become inadequate. Dramatic growth had made that particular cemetery a health hazard to the growing population and an obstacle for further economic growth. Hence the formation of the Mahoning Cemetery Association. In response to the problems facing the township, they created a cemetery that would offer permanence to the interred and the citizens of Youngstown. You can't understate the importance of families in the formation, operation, and maintenance of rural cemeteries. These organizations were often made up of a network of wealthy families from the area. They not only maintained the cemeteries, but they were instrumental in filling them out with impressive family plots. A wonderful example of a family plot is this, the William Powers Family Memorial. If you notice, it's dominated by a central family monument, a beautiful obelisk here set upon a pedestal and ornamented with garlands. Around the family monument is curbing that would direct carriages up to the site. In addition, you see garden ornaments and furnishings. This was meant to evoke a park-like setting that would be enjoyed by the family and visitors alike. The rural cemetery movement became popular in the United States from the 1830s through the late 19th century, though it has its roots in Great Britain and Europe. Père Lachaise, outside of Paris, is often credited as the first fully realized rural cemetery, dating from 1804. It was a popular tourist destination and certainly many Americans visited and were most likely inspired by what they saw. Mount Auburn, outside of Boston, Massachusetts, is the first fully realized American rural cemetery. And compared to Père Lachaise, it had a uniquely American landscape. No doubt, many people from across the country visited Mount Auburn and came back to their communities inspired to build their own rural cemetery. The primary function of a rural cemetery was to inter the dead in a place that was secure for perpetuity. But in addition, they were seen as community assets. They provided the first park-like spaces for the citizens of their community. In addition, they also served as art museums and historical societies. Location was very important to the development of rural cemeteries. They had to be located far enough from urban centers to provide security, but close enough that they could actually serve the public. Oak Hill Cemetery is a prime example. Though it seems as though it's embedded in the city today, you have to remember this was the countryside in 1850. Designs of the rural cemetery were based on design principles of the picturesque, a harmonization between art and nature composed within a landscape. Components of the picturesque included sloping sites with winding drives and paths that allowed for changing and often dramatic vistas. During the mid-19th century, most of the valley surrounding Oak Hill was open pastures and fields, allowing for panoramic views that spatially extended the boundaries of the cemetery. A variety of memorial monuments are used to punctuate the landscape, executed in an array of historicized architectural styles and configurations. They create an interplay between the man-made and the natural. Finally, the landscape is enhanced with specimen trees and shrubbery, artfully arranged within the landscape. By 1865, John Brenner had been hired as a full-time superintendent to maintain not only the grounds, but to craft early grave markers.
So I'm going to show you around some of the monuments and some of the people who are buried here at Oak Hill Cemetery. And we're starting at the highest point in the cemetery to talk about arguably the most important person buried here, and that is Governor David Todd, who was born in 1805, and he came here to Youngstown with his family. Now, as a young child, he decided he wanted to go into politics, kind of follow his father, who was a lawyer and a judge. And then around the 1820s, he was accepted to the Ohio bar. Now, he had kind of a failed introduction into politics. So in the 1840s, he came back here to Youngstown, and he tried to start farming up at the family farm up on Briar Hill. Well, they determined that farming was definitely not one of his best skills, but what they found there at Briar Hill was coal. So his fortune was kind of set for his future. So they started mining up there at Briar Hill, where he made a ton of money and set himself apart as a great early businessman here in the Mahoning Valley. He was instrumental in bringing the railroad here, but around the outbreak of the Civil War, he decided to head back into politics. And in 1861, he was elected governor of Ohio. He was very supportive of the Union during the Civil War and actually was great friends with President Abraham Lincoln. So much so that in 1864, President Lincoln offered him the position to be the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, Todd is going to decline that position because his health was kind of failing. And in 1868, he passed away at his home here in Youngstown. Now, when he was buried here, they chose this spot for its prominence. And if you can imagine behind me, none of these trees would have been here. So the view of the Mahoning Valley, even all the way up to his home at Briar Hill, would have been visible. And you can see in that historic photograph that there was a solarium built over top of his grave so that folks could place flowers there all year long. A very fitting memorial to Governor David Todd. So just down the hill from Governor David Todd is another very prominent 19th century businessman, William Rayen. Now, he came here around 1802 from Westmoreland County in Pennsylvania, and he had a number of businesses and public service positions, working as both our Postmaster General and a judge in the Court of Common Pleas. He had a shop right where Federal Street meets Fifth Avenue that he operated with James Mackey. But he's most known for the money that he left behind to start the Rayen School. It was just over $30,000, and it was Youngstown's only high school until 1911. The school had a predominantly female faculty and was known for accepting any student from the Mahoning Valley who wanted to learn there.
The most common memorial found in a cemetery is the simple headstone, such as these three diminutive stones featuring sculpted lambs. The Victorians used the lamb as a symbol of the death of a young child. Of the various types of memorials one could choose from in the 19th century, the sculptural monument was very popular. One of the more interesting and fascinating forms of the sculptural monument is the tree stone. This particular grave is for Elizabeth Brown. Typically, the tree stone was selected for lives cut short, someone who was young when they died. Elizabeth Brown was 97.5 years old. The cut tree stump symbolizes a life interrupted or a life ending. Cut branches tended to symbolize members of the family who had fallen before. The peeled back bark offered a smooth surface for carving names, dates, and other phrases as seen here. As you get towards the bottom of the trunk, you will find a literal interpretation of the Christian faith in an open Bible. Written inside is scripture from the Beatitudes. Tree stone monuments were popular in the late 19th century, up through the turn of the century. They were part of the rusticity movement, America's fascination with fading wilderness expressed in architecture and decorative items. Think of Adirondack cabin and twig furniture.
So I'm going to bring you now to a part of the cemetery not too many people come to, because it's down a pretty steep hill. And we're going to talk about a family interred in a mausoleum built into the side of the hill to the Streely family that lived right here in Youngstown. Now, the patriarch of the family was named Sensony, and Sensony Streely came to Youngstown from Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Now, he worked here as a machinist, and when the Civil War broke out, he was one of the first people to enlist from Youngstown. He served throughout some pretty major campaigns, in the Eastern Theater like Antietam and Gettysburg with the 125th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Now, he was injured during the war, and that injury plagued him for the rest of his life. But what plagued the family even more was what happened to his son, John. Soldiers in the company were able to protect John's body and keep it safe from being captured by the enemy. And later that night, they took his body to the local hospital where he passed away from that ankle injury. Now, he's buried there at the Chickamauga and Chattanooga battlefield, but he's memorialized here in the family mausoleum. I can't imagine what it would have been like for his father to watch his son die, and that pain also stayed with Sensini the rest of his life. So after the Civil War, Sensini came back here to Youngstown, where he was pretty active in the community, especially with the local Todd chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was a veterans organization for Union soldiers. When he passed away, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people. His coffin was draped in the American flag, exactly what you would expect from the vice president of the local Todd chapter. Now, his wife Martha lived a few years longer, and when she passed away, she was the oldest member of the Trinity Methodist Church. Now, buried with them are a couple of family members, but there's also some mysterious guests who have joined the Streely family in the family vault. One of those mysterious guests is the family's dentist, Dr. Sardis Dybel, and honestly, we're not really sure why he's in there. And another one is a family neighbor, Elizabeth Whitehead. Joining all of them was a young woman named Maud Kelly. She passed away after some pretty serious complications following a surgery. Also in there is a Prussian immigrant named Ernst Kurtz, and he was pretty active here in Youngstown as a member of the city council, and also very instrumental in starting Wick Park up on the north side. The last person interred there is a Charles Streely, but our research hasn't uncovered if he's a family relative or another mysterious guest. In addition to the large dedicated Civil War section, there are Civil War soldiers buried all over Oak Hill Cemetery, including these two brothers, Oscar and Elijah Bodges. They were both born enslaved in Virginia, but gained their freedom after their master passed away. Oscar moved to Pennsylvania when he was 20 and enlisted in the United States Colored Troops at the outbreak of the Civil War. During the Siege of Petersburg in 1865, his gallantry won him the Butler Medal of Honor. Being a black soldier, he was actually unable to receive what we know as the Congressional Medal of Honor. After the war, he and his brother Elijah moved here to Youngstown, where they worked as stonemasons and bricklayers. They were both actively involved in the AME church here, the first African-American congregation in the community. Now, Oscar's buried right here with his wife, and Elijah, the brother, is right behind them. Now, they owe these wonderful headstones to a great historian named Stephan Jones, who did remarkable research to make sure that these black soldiers got the recognition and the military headstones that they deserved. So here we are right at the entrance of Oak Hill Cemetery to a mausoleum that not too many people notice. And this is dedicated to a true American hero, John Logan. John Logan Jr. really wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. John Logan Sr. being a very prominent Civil War general who was basically responsible for establishing Memorial Day as a national holiday. Now, John Logan Jr. decided to enlist in the Army after the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. And when he left for the Philippines, none of us knew that he was never going to come back. Now, at a battle there, his death was pretty widely scrutinized. He was hit by a sniper, and a lot of people had a lot to say about what happened at that moment. The Youngstown Vindicator covered the story with amazing fanfare, and it was months later before his body was finally brought back here to Youngstown, where he is interred right here in this mausoleum. Following John's death, he received the Medal of Honor, our highest military honor for his gallantry in the Philippines. Not only is John memorialized inside the mausoleum, but he has a military headstone, which is quite unusual to have both.
The next memorial monument I would like to discuss is that of Henry and Mary Arms Wick. They died in 1915, only 5 days apart from each other, which explains this unusual and beautiful double sarcophagi monument. The memorial is a three-part composition consisting of 2 sarcophagi resting on a base. The interred are actually buried below in a vault. Behind the sarcophagi is the headstone for the family. It is all executed in gray granite and ornamented simply with Celtic crosses. The sarcophagus became a popular memorial stone in the late 19th century and early 20th century in American funerary architecture. It has its roots in ancient Egypt and has been consistently used throughout Western civilization since then. Sarcophagus is derived from the ancient Greek flesh-eating stone. It refers to a time when limestone sarcophagus were used to help with the decomposition of the body before its bones would be transferred to a permanent resting place. The Celtic cross became a popular symbol at the end of the 19th century as it reflected the ancestry of many of Youngstown's wealthy families, coming from England, Scotland, and Ulster in Northern Ireland. The Celtic cross itself, it has its origins in pagan culture. Legend has it that when St. Patrick came to Ireland, he reinterpreted the Celtic's cross to become a Christian symbol. The circle that surrounds the Christian cross is a symbol of eternity.
This mausoleum here is dedicated to the Beekner family. William Beekner was born and raised in Germany, where he received his medical training. Now, when he came here to the United States, he was pretty active in our local medical history, especially early on in the 1840s. Now, you might recognize his name because of his daughter, Lucy. The family had some pretty tragic deaths, but Lucy decided to make sure the family would be remembered in a positive way. When she passed away, she left the bulk of the family's fortune to start a home for student girls and to make sure that women who were employed would have a safe place to stay while they were getting an education. Today, it's known as Beekner Hall at YSU, and it is still serving that purpose that Lucy was hoping for. Now we're going to take a stroll around one of the most prominent areas at Oak Hill Cemetery, and that's this plot dedicated to the Wick family. Now behind me is one of the most beautiful statues here, and that's dedicated to Caleb Baldwin Wick. And join me as we walk around to see some of the other family members buried here. Now let's take a look at what's perhaps the largest mausoleum here at Oak Hill, and that is to Charles Dayton Arms. Now he came here in the 1840s from New York, and he was pretty involved in local coal mining, where he made quite a fortune for himself. Now he and his wife Hannah had 6 daughters, one of which hopefully you know pretty well, and that was Olive Arms. Olive Arms was born in 1865, and she was an amazing artist throughout her entire life. By the turn of the century, she had married Wilford, a distant cousin, and she began designing her home, Greystone. Now that home is a beautiful example of the arts and crafts design style, and she designed everything from the door handles and the cabinet hinges to the overall look of the house. Now later in her life, she decided to leave that home to us, the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, and today we operate it as the Arms Family Museum. Now Wilford is also interred in this mausoleum, and so are her sisters Catherine and Caroline. The cenotaph behind me is dedicated to George Dennick Wick, another local prominent businessman, just like pretty much everybody else in this Wick family plot. But his life takes a pretty tragic turn in 1912, when he and his family board the steamship Titanic. Now, we all know the story of the Titanic, and when it hit that iceberg, George waved goodbye to his family who were still waiting to get into a lifeboat, and he went down with the ship. Now, the cenotaph is dedicated to him, next to his first wife, Mary, and his second wife, Mary.
By the early 20th century, Oak Hill Cemetery had fallen into decline. Encroaching urbanism and industrial development made it a less desirable site. In addition, revenues were falling as competing suburban cemeteries drew potential clients away from Oak Hill Cemetery. By 1924, the association knew it had to do something, and they embarked on a major renovation project that would secure the future of Oak Hill Cemetery. Henry Manning Garlick took charge of the renovations. He hired a prominent architect to both design and oversee the work. Improvements included the addition of fencing and perimeter walls to secure the site. In addition, driveways and paths were paved. And stone curbing, stormwater, drainage, and water service were all added. There was limited restoration to the monuments themselves, and a whole new planting design was implemented, much of which we see today. Throughout the cemetery, you're going to find monuments executed in a variety of historical styles, including the neoclassical, such as the Robert McCurdy monument located behind me. It is a colossal composite column. It's a tripart composition including a base, column, and urn. It begins with a simple base that elevates the column above the profane world of the ground. The column itself is a symbol of triumph. In Victorian times, a single column typically designated the memorial for the head of a household. The column rises up in triumph, and on top lies the funerary urn. The urn is a symbol of mortality, and it references the classical practice of memorializing one's cremated ashes. This particular urn is decorated with acanthus leaves, another ancient symbol of death. Its thorny leaves represent life's prickly journey and the final triumph of eternal life.
On this hill is a pretty nondescript headstone, but it's dedicated to one of the most influential people in all of Mahoning Valley history, and that is Warren P. Williamson, Jr. Most people knew him as the boss, and he started an empire that's still here in Youngstown. As a child, he was a very technically minded kid, and he loved radios. And it was in the 1920s that he started his very first broadcast in what will become WKBN Broadcasting. And we still know and love the legacy that he left behind.
WKBN TV pioneered in broadcasting the first color television pictures in the Youngstown area. Channel 27 has long been proud of its pioneering status. And now we're able to add another new dimension.
So thank you guys for joining us on our virtual Oak Hill Cemetery tour. I want to encourage you to get outside, explore our awesome historic cemeteries here in the valley. I will see you back here next year.